And we're back with Tristan Hopper, who is an investigative journalist and political columnist with the National Post, who has a new book out that says, Don't Be Canada. It's its title. Very provocative, but also very relatable. Talking about all the things that Canada did wrong. And before the break, we talked about the whole harm reduction experiments that we've been trying to do unsuccessfully for about a decade. But of course, that's not the entirety of the book here. I mean, you've also spoken about the like deep, deep, deep flaws of our criminal justice system. And I'm wondering if you can explain some of those flaws to us today. For example, bail. We hear often that our bail system is broken. What does that exactly mean?
It's essentially means, I mean, if you live in Canada, there's been any number of news stories, just a random stabbing, a mass shooting, whatever. I mean, it's become routine now in Canada when there is some, horrifying, random, preventable tragedy. You pull up the news story and just scroll to a certain, point of it, and then you find out that the suspect was out on bail, on early release, on early parole. So this is something, and throughout the book, I mean, I can't blame any of this on any one particular government. So, the word Justin Trudeau appears only a handful of times in the book, but it's essentially a system that is wholly incapable of sort of keeping a dangerous suspect behind bars for any length of time. So I think that's probably the most surprising thing when I explain it to Canadians. I think maybe we're watching too much U.S. media. We assume if someone is a threat to the community, if someone has murdered more than one person, if someone is a serial child molester, is released from jail and continues to molest children and is caught again, you assume that, this is Canada. Obviously, they're being put away in behind bars and they are no longer a threat to public safety. And, I just provide the evidence in the chapter to show that's just not the case. I mean, when you have someone who is, very much a high risk to reoffend, gets out and immediately offends again, that's not an anomaly. That's the system working as intended. So for a variety
But
of reasons,
why is the system working that way? So why do we let people out on bail so easily? There must be some justification, some
it's
legislation we can
essentially
point to.
yeah. Essentially a justice system going all the way back to the 1980s that very much prioritizes release above everything else. And we've had cases in which you even have a serial killer, someone who was murdered 4 Indigenous women in prison. And the families of his victims will be told, we are eventually putting him towards release. So there's basically no mechanism within the Canadian system that anyone just stays behind bars permanently because they are a risk to the public safety. So even in extreme cases where you have a serial killer, the system is oriented towards rehabilitating them and getting them out of prison as soon as possible. So that's just sort of a social change. And then you've seen changes. Bill C-75 was sort of the big one in the past few years, in which you saw a laxening of sentencing and a laxening of bail, very much specifically along identity lines. So we saw this was a case. I'm actually forgetting the name of the officer. An officer killed in a random traffic stop in Ontario, and his accused shooter had been released on bail, and the judge at the time was saying, we think he is a high risk to reoffend. I feel uncomfortable about giving him bail. However, under the terms of Bill C-75, which explicitly told judges to consider the background details, whether someone came from a marginalized community, based on those parameters, he's a member of a First Nation, so we have to let him out. So it's sort of going back 40 years, this idea that our justice system is always pushing offenders towards release, seeing prison as an inherently bad thing. They should eventually be released. We should make that happen as soon as possible, mixed with a whole bunch of identity politics, particularly in the last few years.
Well,
And,
so you said this goes back 40 years. So what are the origins here? So what happened in the 1980s and 1990s that set the stage for what we see today?
I think you could trace it all the way back to the 1970s. So this was just sort of, I mean, we used to just, execute criminals. And then, of course, that was changed. It was a popular change at the time. I mean, to get rid of it. But this was just mixed. We replaced capital punishment with sort of 25-year sentences. And then this sort of, in terms of 25-year sentences. And then I think there was just sort of a laxness that was eventually just put into the system that I don't think people realized how much it was oriented towards early release. That
Okay,
didn't really answer your question, but
so there was a slow change in norms that people didn't realize were destructive until it was a little bit too late, right? I don't imagine that people who were accepting these gradual changes in the 1970s and 1980s would have imagined the system that we have today, where you have serial murderers being let out on bail with almost no barriers. But we're going to talk more about that when we get back from the break, and we'll talk specifically about sentencing.